Welcome to Exploring the Roots of Energy. I'm your host, Marco Lane, and this podcast is all about diving deep into the world of bioenergetics, how energy drives everything in our bodies, from our moods and hormones to chronic diseases like cancer and diabetes. Today, we're reviewing insights from the Generative Energy Podcast #1 with Roddy and Georgi Dinkov, two well-known voices in the bioenergetic field, influenced heavily by the late Dr. Ray Peat. If you're curious about how stress, metabolism, and diet impact your health, you're in the right place. In this episode, we'll explore how chronic stress and high cortisol levels lead to burnout, why fatty liver disease can progress to cancer without any genetic mutations, and how competitive athletes might not be as healthy as they seem. We'll also break down how cells communicate not just chemically, but electromagnetically, why your waking body temperature can reveal hidden thyroid issues, and how arachidonic acid from your diet fuels inflammation. This isn't your typical health podcast. We're questioning mainstream narratives and exploring solutions rooted in energy metabolism. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive into the fascinating world of energy, health, and everything in between. Let's start with one of the biggest hidden culprits of modern burnout, cortisol. Georgi and Danny had a lot to say about how this stress hormone affects everything from your mood to your metabolism. Let's break it down. Burnout is a word we hear all the time, at work, in relationships, even in our hobbies. But what's really behind it? Roddy and Georgi Dinkov break it down perfectly in Generative Energy Podcast #1. Burnout isn't just mental exhaustion. It's a physiological state driven by chronic stress and elevated cortisol. Cortisol, often called the stress hormone, initially gives us that burst of energy and focus. But when it stays elevated for too long, the body pays the price. As Georgi mentions, prolonged high cortisol levels lead to energy depletion, leaving you feeling flat, unmotivated, and emotionally drained. This isn't just in your head. Your cells literally start running out of fuel. Burnout doesn't happen overnight. It's the result of pushing through stress without proper recovery. Over time, high cortisol interferes with mitochondrial energy production, reducing ATP, the energy currency of our cells. As Danny points out, it's why so many people feel like they're running on fumes, even after a full night's sleep. And here's the kicker. While cortisol is meant to be a short-term solution to stress, in our modern world of constant pressures and endless notifications, it becomes a long-term problem. Georgi highlights that chronic cortisol elevation doesn't just leave you tired. It disrupts metabolism, weakens your immune system, and can even lead to depression by depleting essential hormones like progesterone and testosterone. So, if you've ever wondered why you feel so drained despite doing everything right, cortisol might be the culprit. The good news? Understanding this is the first step to recovery. In the next segment, we'll dive into how a seemingly unrelated condition, fatty liver disease, can progress to cancer without a single change in your genes. Stay tuned. One of the most eye-opening points from Roddy and Georgi Dinkov's conversation is how fatty liver disease can progress to cancer without any changes to your genes. This flips the traditional medical narrative on its head. Georgi explains that many doctors believe disease is rooted in genetic mutations. But here's the shocking truth. Fatty liver disease, which starts as a metabolic issue, can develop into cirrhosis and even cancer without altering a single gene. The culprit? A chronic energy deficit at the cellular level. When your cells can't produce enough energy, they start accumulating fat, especially in the liver. Over time, this buildup triggers inflammation, scarring, and eventually fibrosis. Danny highlights how this process is entirely metabolic. It's driven by poor mitochondrial function, not faulty DNA. As Georgi emphasizes, this isn't just a liver problem, it's a systemic issue. Cells communicate constantly, both chemically and electromagnetically. When one part of the body struggles, the whole system feels it. In the case of fatty liver, chronic energy depletion leads to adaptive but harmful changes, pushing the body toward disease. What's most striking is that this entire process mirrors what we see in cancer development. Cancer isn't just rogue cells going wild. It's the body's desperate attempt to survive under extreme stress and energy deficiency. And guess what? You don't need a genetic mutation for that to happen. In our next section, we'll explore how our cells communicate and why this interplay is crucial for understanding metabolic health. You won't want to miss it. One fascinating insight from the Generative Energy podcast is how cells communicate, not just chemically, but also electromagnetically. Roddy and Georgi Dinkov dive deep into this, explaining that our bodies are far more interconnected than we often realize. Georgi points out that every cell in your body is in constant communication, sending signals through chemicals like hormones and neurotransmitters, but also through electromagnetic fields. Why does this matter? Because when your metabolism is off, when your cells aren't producing enough energy, these communication lines break down. Danny emphasizes that this isn't just about one isolated organ failing. It's a systemic issue. If your liver is struggling, for example, your brain, heart, and muscles will feel the impact too. Georgi compares it to a failing electrical grid. One broken line can cause outages across an entire city. In our bodies, poor mitochondrial function or chronic stress disrupts cellular signals, leading to widespread metabolic dysfunction. What's even more compelling is that this breakdown in communication isn't random. It often starts with stress hormones like cortisol, serotonin, and estrogen, overpowering protective hormones like thyroid, progesterone, and DHEA. This hormonal imbalance further weakens the cellular conversation, pushing the body into a chronic low-energy state. This interconnectedness is key to understanding metabolic health. Fixing one issue isn't enough. You need to restore the entire system. Up next, we'll explore how something as simple as your morning temperature and pulse can reveal if your metabolism is on track. Stay tuned. One of the most practical takeaways from Roddy and Georgi Dinkov's discussion is how simple daily measurements can reflect your metabolic health. It can signal low thyroid function, and that's crucial because thyroid hormones drive your metabolism. But there's more to it. Danny points out that thyroid, testosterone, and progesterone all have positive effects on heart function, both in how strongly your heart beats, inotropic effect, and how fast it beats, chronotropic effect. A low morning temperature, along with a sluggish pulse, might indicate that these protective hormones are running low. Georgi emphasizes that this isn't just about feeling cold or tired. It's a sign that your body isn't producing enough energy. And when energy production lags, your stress hormones, like cortisol, take over. Over time, this leads to systemic metabolic issues, from poor muscle recovery to brain fog. The beauty of this insight? It gives you a simple tool to track your health at home. A thermometer and a pulse check each morning can reveal more than you think. Coming up next, are competitive athletes really as healthy as they seem? Danny and Georgi tackle this myth head-on. There's this common belief that competitive athletes represent the pinnacle of health. But Georgi Dinkov challenges that idea in this podcast episode with Roddy. Sure, athletes seem fit on the outside, but Georgi explains that many competitive athletes are actually running on stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. It's not sustainable. Over time, their bodies pay the price. He mentions the female athlete triad, a condition marked by amenorrhea, bone loss, and depression, which is common among top-performing female athletes. And for male athletes, there's a term too, exercise-induced hypogonadism, meaning their bodies produce less testosterone due to chronic stress and overtraining. Danny adds that many athletes rely on performance-enhancing substances to mask these issues. But once they retire, the stress catches up. Many rapidly gain weight, lose muscle mass, and face long-term metabolic damage. The takeaway? Performance doesn't always equal health. High stress and overtraining can suppress thyroid function, tank hormone levels, and leave even elite athletes metabolically compromised. Coming up next, what is cancer really? Georgi and Danny break down why cancer might be the body's desperate attempt at repair when energy production fails. This section is mind-blowing. Georgi Dinkov, inspired by Ray Peat's work, explains that cancer might not be what we think it is. We often see cancer as this rogue, destructive force, but Georgi suggests it's actually the body's last-ditch effort at repair when energy production is severely compromised. Here's the logic. When cells don't have enough energy, when mitochondria can't produce enough ATP, they revert to their most basic function: growth. Not controlled, specialized growth, but chaotic, unrestrained growth. Georgi points out that in healthy conditions, energy fuels not just function, but also precise repair. But when energy is scarce, cells lose their ability to differentiate into specialized tissues. Instead, They just multiply uncontrollably. That's what we call cancer. He also highlights that hormones like estrogen, serotonin, and prolactin, which rise under chronic stress, block proper energy production and push cells toward this primitive growth state. On the flip side, protective hormones like progesterone, pregnenolone, and DHEA, all produced when metabolism is healthy, help prevent this breakdown. The takeaway? Cancer isn't just a genetic mutation gone wrong. It's a metabolic failure, and restoring proper energy production might be the key to prevention and healing. Next up, we'll dive into how arachidonic acid drives inflammation and why PUFA, or polyunsaturated fats, might be the silent culprit behind many chronic diseases. All right, let's talk about inflammation, something Georgi and Danny discuss in depth and something Ray Peat consistently warned about. Inflammation is often painted as a necessary evil, right? We hear it's part of healing, or it's your body fighting off threats. But Georgi argues that chronic inflammation is actually the root of most diseases, from diabetes and heart disease to cancer and even infections. So where does this inflammation come from? Enter arachidonic acid, a fatty acid derived from the omega-6 polyunsaturated fats, PUFA, we find in so many processed foods. Georgi breaks it down. Arachidonic acid is converted into prostaglandins, leukotrienes, and thromboxanes, the trio responsible for around 80% of the body's inflammatory response. And guess what? The more PUFA you eat, the more you feed this inflammatory fire. PUFA also changes how our cells interact with water, increasing their affinity for it, which can trigger unwanted cell growth. Combine that with stress hormones like estrogen, serotonin, and prolactin that block energy production, and you've got the perfect storm for chronic inflammation and metabolic dysfunction. This section is a wake-up call. Cutting back on PUFA might be one of the simplest, most impactful changes you can make for your health. And that wraps up this episode of Exploring the Roots of Energy. If you found these insights helpful, make sure to subscribe and share. Until next time, stay curious and stay energized.